just want to say thank you all for joining us. I know from Twitter and other social media sources that being a teacher in New York right now is not a very easy thing to be doing. And so I just want to acknowledge that I know people are having a very difficult time right now. So I thank you for taking, this time to join us today and to learn a little bit about my work and chimpanzees. And I'll try to make it fun to maybe even just try to take your mind off of what else is going on right now a little bit. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about my life, how I got to be a primatologist, a little bit about my work, and a little bit about kind of some of the other things that I do as a researcher and as a primatologist. So, and as Emily and Jen said, we'll hold questions for the end, but feel free to ask me anything about chimpanzees, primates, animals, whatever, my life. I'm very happy to answer all of those. So I am, as Emily mentioned, a professor at Tufts University, and I am in actually the department. My primary department is in anthropology, but I'm also affiliated with the Department of Biology. And for the last probably 22, 23 years, I have been working and doing work with chimpanzees, both in captivity and in the wild. And I have put my contact information here. This is my email address, so feel free to email me if you need anything or have questions or follow-up questions after today. And I'll also put the email address on the last slide so you can jot it down later. So just to get us all in the mood for studying chimpanzees, one of the things that I study that Emily didn't mention is that I do have kind of a body of research on vocalizations and trying to understand what chimpanzees are saying to each other. And this is very much kind of an anthropological endeavor because as an anthropologist, I'm interested in the evolution of humans. And one of the things that really sets us apart is our ability to use language and how much we use language and how much of our kind of society is built on our ability to speak. And so I have done a number of studies kind of trying to figure out what chimps are saying to each other and how they use language and whether or not these signals are intentional. And so one of my favorite vocalizations that chimpanzees give, they give about 60 different kinds of sounds in communication. But one of my favorites and one of the ones that you'll hear very commonly if you're in the field with me is a pant hoot. This is something we'll hear almost every single day. And it's a very loud call. We can actually hear it for almost 2 to 3 miles in a rainforest. So they can be very, very loud. And this is in many ways a call of excitement. This is something that they give when they're socially very excited, often in a positive way. So if they find an amazing food tree, if 2 chimps who haven't seen each other in a while come together, all sorts of things that might be very exciting. And it's also an interesting call in many ways, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it after you get a chance to listen to it. So most of the time, anytime I give a talk in schools, I make the kids do a pant hoot. And so I'm not going to make you all do a pant hoot, but I will demonstrate it for you. I will say that this is pretty loud, so you might want to even crank your volume up if you need a little pick-me-up. But sometimes Zoom actually will cut me off because it's so loud. So I hope it won't do it this time, but sometimes it does. So the pant hoot comes in 4 stages. So the first is just kind of like very heavy breathing. So, and then they are excited. So it gets louder and more excited, and it's called the build-up phase, and it's, and then there's the hoot, and the hoot is the loud part of the call. It's also the part of the call that's the most individually distinctive. So different chimpanzees have different sounding hoots. So it could be something like kind of more melodic, like, woo, woo, or it could be kind of more like a scream, like, ah, kind of like that. And then, especially if you're talking to young children, you have to tell them that the chimpanzees stop hooting eventually. They'll just keep screaming otherwise. And they have this kind of relaxed phase where it's just like the letdown, like, woo, woo, woo. So if you put it down, if you put it all together, someone's dog is going crazy right now. So that's a sign of a good pant hoot. So if you put it all together, it kind of sounds like this. So I will So that's my way of saying hello. I'm very excited to be here. Here is a chimp. This is a chimp of ours named Johnny giving his pant hoot. I see from the chat that I did get cut off, which is just a very big disappointment for me, but that's okay because it does mean that it was very loud. And so I did say this is an interesting call. Not only do they give this call in the context of kind of excitement and when two chimps haven't seen each other, there are some interesting things about this call. So one of the things that we know about this call is that males are more likely to give this call than females. So that might suggest something about it being a very social thing, and I'll explain that in a little bit. We also know that two chimpanzees who are friends with each other are more likely to pant hoot together. And when they pant hoot together, they make their call sound like each other. So they kind of like imitate each other, which again might signify a social bond. We know from work at my field site that when that chimpanzee testosterone, so we actually can get measures of testosterone, that chimpanzees who have higher testosterone actually have a different kind of sounding pant hoot. And also that chimpanzees who are higher ranked have a different sounding pant hoot. And finally, we know that these calls have kind of accent. So chimpanzees in one community actually sound a little bit different from chimpanzees in a neighboring community. So they might be able to use this call to figure out which group the sound that they're hearing, who that individual is, what their rank is, whether they're a male or female, and then whether they're a friend, part of the same community, or an enemy, part of a neighboring community. So there's a lot of cool stuff that we can tell about chimps from just the sound of their voices. And I'm not going to talk more about that part of my research, but feel free to ask questions later on. So as I get into this talk, I just wanted to just preface this by saying that some of this, the way that I've structured this talk is to mimic a little bit of how I might give a talk to your students, especially like high school students who are thinking about college. I wanted to do that because I wanted to kind of demonstrate a little bit the value to you of having guest speakers or guest scientists come and talk to your classes. And I think that's something that Emily and I have talked a little bit about. So I am a primatologist. A primatologist is a biologist who specifically studies primates. You don't have to necessarily be wild primates. So a lot of primatologists work with captive populations. And most primatologists focus on a particular study species. So I'm a primatologist who has focused entirely on chimpanzees. And you'll meet other primatologists who study baboons or capuchins. And I would say that I did not always want to be a primatologist. So not necessarily. So I grew up in Toronto. I went to an all-girls school in Toronto where science was a big part of our curriculum. And I have a very distinct memory of being probably 4 or 5. This picture was taken when I was a teenager. It's like a horror, one of those like embarrassing pictures of me as a teenager. I'm right in the middle here. But I have this memory when I was 4 or 5 of watching a documentary about the chimpanzees who were in the space program. And it was really interesting. And they actually interviewed Jane Goodall, and underneath her name, it said primatologist. And they interviewed John Glenn, and underneath his name, it said astronaut. And I remember thinking, wow, those both sound cool. And I ran to, this is well before the internet existed because I'm old. And I pulled out our World Book encyclopedias and I looked up astronaut and I looked up primatologist and I was like, oh my gosh, these are so cool. And I think because I was young, I always knew that I wanted to, I think a lot of young people love animals and decide that they want a career with animals. But at the time, I didn't really think of primatology as a career necessarily. I thought, well, I want to work with animals and I want to be an astronaut. And so people who want to work with animals are veterinarians. So I had this like weird fantasy in my brain that I was going to be an astronaut veterinarian. Because I think when I was 5, I just thought that chimpanzees lived in space. And so I remember telling my mom at dinner that I needed to be an astronaut veterinarian because chimps lived in space and someone needed to go take care of them. So it turns out that's not a job at all in any way, shape, or form. And so as I grew up and became, a teenager, still very interested in biology and science and still very interested in animals, kind of shifted that towards really wanting to be a wildlife veterinarian. And I think still for many animal lovers who are in high school, even, you really think that one of the only jobs that you can do is a veterinarian. And that really stuck to me. But there was something about being a wildlife veterinarian that I thought was much more appealing, because I think there is an aspect of that astronaut, like explorer thing that really appealed to me. And I didn't want to just kind of be a vet in a clinic in Toronto. I really wanted to explore the world as well. So when I graduated high school, I definitely had this focus of being a veterinarian. And I went off to college. And it was actually a little bit hard for me, because when I was in college, when I was in high school, my two great loves, like the two things that I love studying the most, were history and biology. And when I went to college in Canada, which has a slightly, different educational system than we have here in the United States. And at the time, I really felt like I couldn't do both of these things. It was too hard. They were too different. I had to pick one. And so when I applied to college, you had to state what major you're going to do in advance. And so I really said, well, I want to be a veterinarian, so I'm going to focus on biology. And I packed my bags and I headed over to Montreal, and I went to McGill University, and I started out as a biology major. And again, in Canada, things are a little bit different. And so we didn't have like a liberal arts education. So for me, my biology major was, what was it? It was like something like 27 classes in biology. And that's what you had to finish. Maybe a fellow McGill graduate in the audience. And when I was at McGill, I think this was really the life-changing moment for me. And there were a couple of lessons that I took from my time at McGill that I think were really transformational. So as a student, I got involved in research, and my senior thesis, one of my biology senior thesis, was actually on a unicellular algae called Chlamydomonas reinhardtii, which I loved every single aspect of doing this kind of lab work. I was looking at the effects of climate change. This is also like in 1999. So I was looking at the effects of climate change on algae, which are one of the world's most important producers of oxygen. And this was a day when we all got up, dressed up in prom dresses, and did science together. But the more important lesson that I took from my time at McGill, and what I think students get from university and hopefully in high school, is that science can be really fun. Like, it's not just a series of facts that you memorize from these giant biology textbooks, but science is actually a process where you do your own experiments and you do things that no one has ever done before. And you think about problems that no one has ever done before. And so I think being able to get involved in research very, very early on was something that was incredibly life-changing for me, to see that it was really fun to do the process of science. And that the memorizing part, that's part of it too, but it's not the most important thing. And so as an educator, I do make it a point to have a lot of students in my lab doing research, even freshmen who come in, and usually every summer I welcome somewhere between 2 to 4 high school students into the lab as well, because I like getting them involved very early in science. Another thing that was really important to me is that college really opened my eyes to the fact that there are so many more disciplines out there than just kind of the things that I was exposed to in high school. And so I was very lucky in many ways that one of the only kind of elective classes that fit my schedule in my probably like second year at McGill was this anthropology class in human evolution. And I was like, oh, okay, well, it has the word evolution in the title. This might be interesting. And I took it, and it changed my life. And it was at that point that I discovered that there was this discipline called biological anthropology, which sometimes is also known as human evolutionary biology. And it was this kind of light bulb moment where I figured out that there was a discipline that combined these things that I loved, because essentially, biological anthropology is the story of human evolution. And it is the kind of trying to figure out what that story is, going back 6 to 8 million years ago when we shared a common ancestor with chimpanzees, and trying to put this puzzle together. And in many ways, it is, sometimes this kind of historical or prehistorical study, but it's rooted in the principles of evolutionary biology. And it was in college that I kind of figured out that there was more than just veterinary science, or more than just biology, that there were these intersections that were super interesting. The third big lesson that I learned is that I fell in love. I did meet my husband in college, which is very nice, but that's not what I mean. I actually, because I wanted to be a wildlife biologist or wildlife veterinarian, one of the things you need to do is have a lot of experience, hands-on experience with wildlife. And so I was looking around Montreal, and I discovered that maybe about 20 minutes outside of the city of Montreal, there is this magical place called the Fauna Foundation. And when I started college, they had just recently welcomed 15 chimpanzees that had been retired from biomedical research to this kind of magical sanctuary where they could live out the rest of their years. Some of them were actually quite young. They were teenagers. So some of them were much older. And so I started volunteering and working at the Fauna Foundation. I spent almost every weekend of my time in college with the people and the animals at Fauna. And this was, again, one of those life-changing moments where I was doing a lot of animal behavior reading and research through my classes. And I was getting this really interesting hands-on experience working with captive chimpanzees, reading about wild chimpanzees, observing captive chimpanzees, and seeing that there was a little bit of a disconnect there. I was reading in the wild, for example, that male chimpanzees are all dominant, socially dominant to female chimpanzees. But when you actually get out, when you're in captive situations, and with the Fauna Foundation chimps, some of the females were actually the most socially dominant of the group. And I thought, well, isn't it fascinating that their behavior can be so flexible and so dependent on the context that they're in. I started reading more about their behavior, and I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. Who gets to do this kind of work? And so then I was graduating, it was time to figure out what the next steps were. And I had in my head this long-term dream of being a wildlife veterinarian that I had pretty much since I was a very small child. But then there was this additional possibility of, maybe being able to do research. This was a very hard choice for me. To me, one option, being a veterinarian, was quite stable. The other option, being, doing a PhD and being a wildlife biologist and living in the jungle, was not only not that stable, but also terrifying to my parents. It came down to the fact that there are very, very few people in the world that actually get to do this job that I have, right? Right now there are probably about 100 people in the world who can say that for a living they study wild chimpanzees. And I thought, if I even just do this for 6 years of my PhD, that would be pretty cool, right? I mean, that's a pretty cool thing to say that you got to do. And so I had applied to vet school and grad school, and I ended up choosing to go to grad school. And I got into a PhD program at Harvard in the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology. And I did my PhD there studying wild chimpanzee behavior. This involved actually living in Uganda for 18 months of my PhD, where I collected data and did a project on male-female relationships. So I was really interested in the evolution of male-female bonds, because that's a very important kind of social bond for humans. And I really wanted to examine what that was like for chimpanzees. And it turns out they really don't have very strong male-female bonds. They really don't have anything that kind of is at all similar to the kinds of pair bonds that we have in human society. So that was a really interesting thing. So like I said, I I spent 18 months straight living in Uganda, working in Badongo Forest, which is in northern Uganda, where Uzma has also been, and working side by side by our Ugandan colleagues and field assistants who are pictured here. And I will say, when students ask, or when anybody asks, field work is hard. I always say, if you don't mind getting dirty, peeing in the woods, not necessarily showering all the time, like all of those things, then you'll probably be okay doing field work. But I had a lot of doubts about whether or not I could do it. If I'm being honest, I'm a pretty kind of girly girl. Like, I love makeup and high heel shoes, and I get all dressed up to teach classes and everything. And so I think a lot of people looked at me and said, I don't think you can do this. And I thought, well, maybe they're right. But they were wrong, actually. I could do it. I not only could do it, I absolutely loved field work. But there are lots of logistical questions, like how much shampoo do you pack? I mean, a lot, or you just don't shampoo. What would you do without electricity? We did have electricity, but sometimes it goes out for 8 to 10 weeks at a time, and you are left reading a lot of paperback books that other people have left at the field site, and you're left without your laptop. You're left without lights after 7:30 at night. And of course, the thing that my mother was always going to ask is, what if something happens to me? Even to this day, she'll still be like, you're going back to Uganda? Oh my gosh. And she reminds me, actually, that when Jane Goodall first went out to Tanzania in 1960, that Jane's mother came with her to help her with her cooking and life. And I have to remind my mother that she definitely does not actually want to do that. So fieldwork was hard, but it was also a moment for me where I got to challenge myself. That even surprised me. I learned a lot about myself. And it was something that I actually was surprised I loved as much as I did. And to me, going back to the field now, going to Uganda, which is where I still work, is almost like going home, right? Like I cried like a baby leaving to go to Uganda. I remember I was actually going through TSA security, and I was crying so hard that the TSA agent started crying. And then when I left Uganda, I cried just as hard. So, it is now a very much a second home to me. I think the thing that I learned from my PhD that was very important is that even though I was doing this PhD on a very specific topic, right, like male-female relationships in chimpanzees, that I learned a tremendous number of transferable skills during the course of my PhD. So I have mad data analysis skills. And I think one of the things that can be very hard for PhD students is, to maybe realize that you don't want to be a scientist or be a professor. Like, what are you going to do in life? And I do actually think that you do learn wonderful skills. I have a lot of friends who did PhDs with me who now work at different social media companies or Amazon, because people absolutely need people who have data analysis skills, right? That is kind of the way that our world is going. I also have a lot of students and colleagues who have ended up going to different kinds of research. So I have a colleague who now works for the Army Medical Research Institute, so not necessarily in academia, and also people who work at different kind of political organizations. And I have a lot of colleagues who also have gone into teaching, because I think, the other thing that you learn as a grad student is how to teach and how to communicate science, or hopefully you're learning some of those things. So when I finished my PhD, I did have one of those moments where I was like, what do I want to do with my life? Do I want to go into Google, or do I want to stay? I ended up actually meeting someone, I think it was from Amazon, like a recruiter, and she was asking me about my life. And she said, look, I would hire you. You have great data analysis skills, but I got to tell you, you love chimpanzees more than anybody I've ever met loves anything. So you should really maybe just study chimpanzees. So that was a good message. And what I ended up doing is staying in academia. And shortly after my PhD was finished, I ended up becoming the director of the Kibale Chimpanzee Project. And I'll tell you more about the site in a little bit, but it's a long-term study of the Kanyawara community of chimpanzees in Kibale National Park, Uganda. And you can follow us. We have a lovely website, and you can also follow us on Twitter if you want, or Facebook. And so the field site's absolutely one of the most beautiful places on Earth to me. I'm obviously very biased. But here's just a little, this is a shot from the porch of my house. It's a time-lapse little video, but you can just see, I mean, I get so homesick. I haven't been able to go back in a very long time. I thought I would get you in the mood a little bit by showing you some videos of what it's like to kind of follow the chimps. So these are all videos from my field site. And one of the things about our project is the chimpanzees have been so kind of habituated to human observation that they'll actually let us go up in the trees with them. So it does actually take quite a bit of effort because we're all roped in and it's all done very safely. But this is a fig tree. We have about 40 different species of fig in our rainforest. This is one of the foods that they will flock to, and it's a big tree, so it fits lots of chimps. We are probably roped in, I would say, about 40 to 50 meters off of the ground. And you'll hear and see kind of the chimps foraging, but it gives you a nice kind of chimp's eye view of the forest and a little bit about what it's like to do what I do. Just the sounds, I mean, the sounds of the forest really are lovely. Chimpanzees spend 50% of their time in trees. So a lot of what I do is like, you know, we don't often climb trees, but that was a nice opportunity to show you that. But a lot of the time we're on the ground looking up at them. But 50% of their time is also spent on the ground. And that's where we actually get really amazing views of their behavior. We know what they're doing in the trees, but on the ground is where we really get up close and personal. And here's a nice video of them on the ground. And this just illustrates a dominance interaction. So this chimp that you'll see at the beginning is named Kakama, and he's the alpha male of the group at the time this video was taken. And he's going to actually walk past a very young, probably about a 12-year-old chimp at the time named Tuke. And you'll see that Kakama's kind of puffed up. He's kind of like really strutting. And Tuke actually gives a vocalization called a pant bark to Kakama. And the pant bark is a signal of, I know I'm subordinate to you, please don't attack me, right? So it's like a very much like submissive vocalization that is a nice interaction, a nice dominance interaction. So that kind of, those are the kind, you know, we'll watch this and then we'll be able to record data on, you know, who is signaling dominance to whom. So let me tell you a little bit more about the project. So like I said, I study the Kanyawara chimpanzee community who live in Kibale National Park, which is actually in southwestern Uganda, which is part of East Africa. So we're pretty close to we're about 100 kilometers from the Congolese and Rwandan borders. Now, the site was started in 1987 by my PhD advisor. So we have been collecting data for this will be our 35th year continuously, except for a 6-month break during 2020 when we shut down during the pandemic. And the site's now run kind of as a collaboration with myself and collaborators Martin Muller and Melissa Emery Thompson, who are at the University of New Mexico. So this is, again, a nice example, especially for students, to illustrate that, you know, science is rarely done these days in any sort of silo. Almost every kind of primatologist I know works on a team and does collaborative work. And so it's important to kind of you know, like you do have to have some social and cooperative skills to do science because everything that we do is now collaborative. So I don't just go out there and take data for the project that I'm working on at the time. We actually have systematic long-term data collection that we've been doing, some of which we've been doing since 1987. So the way that it works is we actually have a team of local Ugandans who works, they're kind of full-time project staff, and they go out in a pair of 2 field assistants. And one field assistant is taking data on a focal individual. So they pick an individual, a target individual for the day, and they follow that individual from the moment they wake up to the moment they go to sleep, and they record what that chimp is doing every single minute of the day. And so it's an incredibly intense kind of data collection protocol. And chimps wake up at around 7 in the morning and they go to bed at around 7 p.m. So it's like 12 hours a day, 12 hours every minute. You're kind of watching what this animal is doing and who they're doing it with. The second field assistant that's going out is taking what we call the behavior records, which is kind of a running narrative of what all of the other chimps in the group are doing at the time. And I'm going to show you examples of this. And then we also take a lot of data on their health and physiology. Now, my job at the project is to manage this long-term data. And so the data is actually written on handwritten notes that I'm going to show you. It then in the field gets transcribed into data sheets in Excel. And then those Excel spreadsheets come to me at Tufts, and I put them all in a Microsoft Access relational database. And this is pretty, when I say I have like mad data analysis skills, I mean, this is when we talk about big data, this is like big data for us. Some of the tables in our database have 4.5 million rows of data in them. So it's like a pretty intense endeavor to manage all of this data collection. And like I said, we're old fashioned. We take data like pen and paper, like Darwin would have done, 150 years ago. This is what some of our behavior notes look like. So you can see 7:58 on May 11th, 2014, Johnny charges and chases and attacks, does a prolonged attack on Yogi Bear with kicks and slaps, and Yogi flees screaming. This is not a surprise, and none of the chimps like Yogi. He's a very sad little character. 8:17, Yogi's coughing. So we get social data, we get health data. 8:22, there's a copulation with screams. Lonjo copulates with Rwanda. It lasts 8 seconds, which is 1 second longer than average. And in this case, the female approaches. We have some intergroup interactions where the chimps heard distant calls and from a neighboring community and respond with aggressive calls. And in total, we actually have almost 100,000 hours of behavioral data on 155. And actually, we just had a baby born, so 156 individuals. I liken this to it's like the greatest soap opera of all time. Like, think about Days of Our Lives, but it's like so much more epic. Like, we come back from the field, sitting around having dinner, like, oh my gosh, you can't believe what I saw today. Kakama beat up Sheldon, and then he had sex with Sheldon's mother. It's that's the kind of stuff that we're observing and that we get to read about in these kind of long-term behavioral notes. I don't expect you to necessarily be able to read this, but this is what our focal data look like. And so the data sheets are very kind of organized and systematic. And it's not necessarily just that they're handwriting, ad lib notes, but we do have protocols for what they're supposed to be recording and how they do it. And it is very systematic. And the field assistants are very well trained. Some of them have actually been with our project for almost 20 years. So, we do like to keep people employed, and they must like their job enough, I suppose. But I said that we also take health and physiology data. So one of the things about our field site is that I think is really cool is that we are known for our physiology data. And what I mean is that we collect urine and fecal samples. And from those fecal and urine samples, we can actually tell a lot about what is happening inside the bodies of chimpanzees, and then we can correlate that to behavior. So here's one of our field assistants, John, who is demonstrating our very, very high-tech urine catcher, which is a stick and a plastic bag tied to the end of a stick. The longer the stick, the less splashback you have from the urine. So that's just a little tip if you ever have to do this. But from a single urine sample from a chimp, we can actually bring that, it gets frozen in the field, gets transported back to the lab in New Mexico. And from a single urine sample, from a male, we can get testosterone measures. From a female, we can get estrogen and progesterone. Humans and chimpanzees are so closely related genetically that we can actually take human pregnancy tests and dip them into chimpanzee urine to figure out if our females are pregnant from a urine sample. We can get measures of cortisol, which is a stress hormone, insulin to figure out energy balance, same with thyroid hormone. We can get measures of creatinine, which is a measure of muscle mass. We can get measures of oxidative stress, which can tell us a lot about how chimps are responding to challenges, and also about aging. We can measure salt, but they don't ever have salt in their urine, so it's not really a problem. It's not something we do. And we can also, we're working on measures of C-reactive protein, which is a measure of inflammation. So we can actually tell something a little bit more about health, even when they don't have kind of outward signs of a health challenge. I'm going to show a gross picture of poop just as a warning next. Fecal samples actually tell us some different information than the urine. But from fecal samples, we've done a lot of studies on diet composition. We can also tell things about how well they're digesting their food. It is very green. They do eat quite a number of leaves in their diet. This is where we might get data on parasite load as well as viral load. So we do a lot of studies where we look at the viruses that are infecting chimpanzees from fecal samples. And we've done a number of publications where we've shown that most of the viruses that are actually killing chimpanzees are coming from human reservoirs. So they are getting things like the common cold, and that can actually have a really disastrous effect on chimp populations. That's not a bone, that's actually probably a parasite or a worm. We see a lot of tapeworms in their feces. Also, interestingly, from their poop, we actually get DNA. And so DNA can tell us a lot of things. So chimpanzees mate promiscuously, so we don't know who the fathers of the babies are unless we have genetic information. But we are also doing some interesting work on malarial resistance, so genes involved in malarial resistance, and we are trying to do some work with methylation. So we can actually do something like a methylation clock, and you can actually figure out kind of how old chimps are, or if they're aging prematurely by how methylated their DNA is. So these are all kind of really cool, creative in many ways techniques to get information about chimps that is more than just watching them and observing them in the wild. And on that note, we've also at our field site kind of, I see a question. I can answer this quickly. Have they been affected by COVID? Not that we know chimpanzees are vulnerable to COVID, but we have taken some extreme precautions to keep them safe. So as far as we know, they have not been infected, but we do know that they can be infected by coronaviruses in general. So we also have to be, I think one of the other lessons that I often talk to kids about is that science can be very creative. Even though you might not kind of equate science and kind of creativity, I actually think, especially when we work in the wild where we're limited with what we can do. I mean, we can't stop and ask our chimps questions. They can't answer questions for us. We also don't dart them. We don't knock them out and get samples from them. We have to do everything we do non-invasively. And this was kind of a weird study, but one of the things that you get from the human fossil record is a lot of teeth. And people, especially people who study human evolution and paleontology, are very interested in when baby chimpanzees get all of their teeth. Like at what age do they get their first baby teeth? When do they lose their baby teeth? And when do they get their permanent teeth? Because this tells us something about development, and we can compare it to the human fossil record. And the way that people had done these kinds of studies before is that they waited for baby chimpanzees in the wild to die, collect their bodies, and then look at their mouths and say, oh, look, this one is this old and has this many teeth. But chimpanzee babies, there aren't that many babies, and they don't die that often. So it's also very sad. So we were thinking, well, what can we do to get this kind of information without waiting for baby chimps to die? And it was actually one of those dinner party moments where someone was asking me what I was thinking about. And I was like, oh, I'm trying to figure out a way to get information on when baby chimpanzees get their teeth. And they're like, well, I don't see why this is so hard. Just take pictures of baby chimpanzees with their mouths open. And I was like, take pictures of baby chimpanzees with their mouths open? That's doing? So I took 10,000 pictures of baby chimpanzees with their mouths open, which actually took about 5 years. So it was not easy. And if you want to know how hard it is, find like a 1-year-old human and see if you can get a really nice, clear image without talking to them and telling them to keep their mouth open. See how well you do with that. Is actually very hard. But we did get them. And like, here's a 56-day-old chimp. You can just see their, their first teeth coming in here and here. This is a 3-year-old, and you can see her first permanent molar. So after 10,000 pictures, we were actually able to sequence the entire dental eruption of chimpanzees. One of those moments where you just have to think a little bit outside the box. This is another one of those moments. Do we see any tooth decay? Yeah, chimpanzees do not brush their teeth. So their teeth can be pretty gross, and they lose their teeth actually as adults quite frequently. Another thing that we want to know is, how do chimpanzees grow? How much do they weigh? How quickly do they grow? Do they have growth spurts? And again, we can't get chimpanzees to we can't ask them to step on a scale. They're not cooperative in any way. We tried everything. We buried scales and covered them up, and the chimps would walk 10 meters around them. We don't give our chimps extra food. So other field sites have like hung bananas on a rope and like on a rope scale and tried to get the chimps' weights from that, but we won't do that. And so again, this is where we had to think a little bit outside the box and be a little creative. And so we actually used lasers, and I literally built a laser on my kitchen table. I had to use trigonometry and physics, which was, not my forte exactly. But I did it, and these are parallel lasers. They're always 4.7 centimeters apart, and we can shine them on the body of a chimp, take a photo, and now we have a ruler in every photograph. And so if those laser dots are 4.7 centimeters apart, which they are, this chimp is 57.3 centimeters long. So we've actually taken 200,000 photographs where we can measure body parts and growth in wild chimpanzees to compare to human growth trajectories. But again, this is one of those moments where sometimes you have a problem and you have to think really outside the box, especially when you work with a wild endangered animal. You have to think, what can we do non-invasively to get this information? So I just wanted to tell you, I know, just in the last couple of minutes, I'll probably go a little bit over here, but hopefully you're having fun. Why 4.7 centimeters? It's just that's what, that's how the laser is configured. That is just how it works. So social bonds in chimpanzees. I wanted to just tell you a little bit about my work, a little bit about what we have found, especially about social relationships. So, if you're out in the forest with the chimps, it is very common that you'll see 2 adult males just sitting there grooming each other. So this is Kakama on the left and Makoku on the right. And this is a very common scene. You can hear some hornbills in the distance. So chimpanzees live in a very particular kind of society, and they actually have a fairly unique social system, which is called fission fusion. So the chimpanzees that I study, there are about 60 chimpanzees in the Kanyawara community, about 12 adult males, and then the rest are adult females and their offspring. And so, and at any time we might have females who have a sexual swelling, and those are these kind of swelling of the labial tissue that's a very visible signal to the males that they are ovulating. But we never see all 60 chimps at once. And what fission fusion means is that the chimps are actually broken up throughout their territory in these smaller subgroups called parties. And like humans, actually, throughout the day, these parties are they're not permanent, so they're temporary, and they actually kind of break up and reform throughout the day. And what this means is that chimpanzees have a lot of choice in who they socialize with, right? Because if Frank's bothering you, you just leave Frank and go find someone else. What we know from our data and from all field sites is that males, there are some pretty prominent sex differences in chimpanzees. So males are more aggressive than females. They also exhibit more cooperative behaviors, and they socialize more. So males have this kind of complex, aggressive, cooperative kind of relationships with each other, and females are relatively not social. And so here's data from my PhD, for example, where when you look at males, they're more likely to be in parties together. When they're in those parties together, they're more likely to sit near each other. And when they're sitting near each other, they're more likely to groom each other than any other female-female or male-female dyad. And what we have actually found is that males have these really actually long-lasting friendships. And these are mutual relationships between adult males. These friendships can last, up to 8 years, potentially longer. They groom each other a lot. They seem to groom each other quite equitably, which is really interesting. And these friendships do actually seem to matter quite a bit. So, for example, we did a study where we took a fake snake and it was a python skin. We stuffed it. We made it look very real. We hid it under some leaves and we waited for 2 chimps to come along. And then we exposed the snake and listened and recorded what they did. And what was fascinating, they would often move away from the snake. But what we found is that chimpanzees are actually more likely to give an alarm call about the snake if the chimp behind them is a friend or a relative. And if it's not a friend or a relative, they often just keep moving without giving an alarm call to warn the other individual. So showing that chimpanzees are probably kind of assholes, but that they're very selective in when they give vocalizations. And these friendships actually do matter quite a bit. So we actually did a little bit of a study looking at these relationships and looking at how relationships change with age in wild chimpanzees. And this is where kind of the anthropologist in me really comes out. And one of the things that we know about humans, which is really interesting, is that young humans, young adults, are really focused on building new friendships and like having lots of friends, even like friends that are like not good influences, right? So friends that are probably don't make you feel that great about yourself. Whereas older adults actually prefer to focus on very positive, emotionally fulfilling relationships compared to when they were younger. So like humans, social networks actually shrink with age, and you just focus on the friends that you really like and get rid of all of these ones that are bad news. The reason that we do this, or psychologists think the reason that we do this, is that we're aware of our mortality. And so as you get older, you're like, I just don't have time for this, right? I don't have time for all these negative people in my life. I'm just going to focus on what really matters. But we don't actually think that chimpanzees have a sense of mortality. And, so it would be really interesting to see whether or not chimpanzees show the same pattern as humans. We know, for example, that other primates actually get kind of negative with age. So humans actually get more positive with age. Like we see the world through more rose-colored glasses as we age. But monkeys actually get more negative at age. They tend to focus on like more negative signals. They don't actually kind of focus on positive things as much. And so many primates actually show this kind of negativity bias in behaviors like grooming and aggression. So they tend to decrease the amount of grooming they do and increase the amount of aggression they do. And this is very much different than what humans do. Humans are like, I'm going to focus on the good things in life. So this is kind of what you might see with a typical monkey. So our chimpanzee is a little bit different. We did a study with our long-term data. This is why you need long-term data, because chimpanzees live till they're in their 60s in the wild. And if you want to study aging in a long-lived animal, you have to have decades of data. So we looked at our focal data. We used 78,000 hours of observation on 21 chimps. And actually what we found was the opposite of what monkeys do, and actually more similar to what humans do. So chimpanzees actually decrease the amount of aggression that they give, which is in red and orange, and they slightly increase the amount of grooming. So they actually also, like we do, get kind of nicer with age, or focus on more positive behaviors at least. And in many ways, chimpanzees also have this focus on kind of more high quality relationships. We can characterize friendships in chimpanzees as like one-sided, like I give and give and give and never get back, right? Those are kind of bad friendships, versus mutual friendships where it's like I give and receive at equal amounts. And chimpanzees, as they age, increase their number of mutual friends. and decrease the number of kind of these one-sided negative relationships as well. So in many ways, what we're finding is patterns in chimpanzees that are very, very similar to humans. And that's actually very interesting. And I know in the chat, it's interesting to me because there isn't an indication that chimpanzees have a sense of mortality. And what I mean by that is it's very experimentally hard to test whether or not they understand mortality. But chimpanzees don't seem to have kind of a consistent response to death of another individual. And in studies where you assess kind of their ability to think in the future or to plan for the future, they don't really have an understanding beyond a few days. So they don't really think ahead or give any indication that they're thinking ahead longer than a few days at most. So why should you care about this, or why should you care about chimpanzees? Well, to me, at least from that study about aging, I think one of the things that it says is that this idea that we shrink our social networks and just focus on positive behaviors is often actually seen as like a pathology. Like, think about, like, we often tell old people like to go out and make new friends and like, hey, just go out and make new friends. And a lot of times their response is, I don't want to make new friends. I have my friends, or I'm happy. Right? I just like who I like, and I don't need new people in my life. And we often think of that as a bad thing, right? We're always thinking like, let's get seniors out and about. And actually, that kind of shrinking of the social network and focus on just a few positive relationships, if we share that with chimpanzees, that might be part of like a shared evolutionary history. That just might be a kind of a natural process of aging. And so rather than maybe focus on like getting seniors out and about and meeting new people, maybe we should focus on giving them opportunities, especially during a pandemic, to connect with the friends that they have and to keep them kind of in the social network that they have. So that's one way that you might even think about using chimpanzee data in kind of a bigger, more everyday kind of interpretation. But the other reason that you should care is that this really does tell us, hopefully, something about ourselves. This is one of our closest living relatives. So we share a last common ancestor with chimpanzees, bonobos, and humans, and that lived probably 5 to 7, maybe as far back as 8 million years ago. Chimps and bonobos actually split about 1 to 2 million years ago. Then I saw in the chat people asking about bonobos. Bonobos have strong female-female bonds. Chimpanzees do not. So that's a big difference between those two species. And I did see someone else ask, chimpanzee females transfer to new communities at adolescence. So it's the males who actually stay in the group that they're born in. And so males are actually in groups with their fathers and brothers and uncles, and females transfer. So to me, really understanding something about chimpanzees can tell us about our own behavior in the kind of the way that I illustrated with the aging study. And I know I went through that quickly, but, I do really think about understanding, it's so hard to be kind of objective when you're out with the chimps, because everything you see reminds you so much about humans. It's one of those species where you go out, it really is fundamentally different following chimpanzees than it is following something like lions, because you go out and you just see your own species in their everyday behavior. And I often show this video when I give talks to kids because I think it's kind of funny and they laugh a lot. This is a 3-year-old named Gola. I have a just turned 4-year-old, and Gola is going to illustrate something that I see often with my 4-year-old. And so you can. And obviously, I'm not saying that nose picking is like evolutionarily ancient, but it's an illustration of, it's really, you go out and you watch chimps and you see our own species. And so I think they really do tell us something about how we evolved. I think the other reason that you should care, I hope you care, they are endangered. And even Darwin, 150 years ago pointed out that the anthropomorphous apes, so the great apes, will most likely be exterminated because of humans. And humans really are the biggest threat to chimpanzee survival. This is Max. He's one of our chimps, and you can see hopefully that Max actually lost both his feet to poacher snares. He lost one when he was 5 and he lost one when he was 8. He's still alive, but he is never going to probably have the life he would have had if he hadn't been injured. He's the lowest ranking adult male. He's never had offspring, but he's kind of a champ. Like, he gets around okay. I'm going to show a quick video. I'm sorry to upset you. I know it is actually can be very difficult. And I think one of the things that I often tell students is that on top of being a researcher, I think one of the things that you'll find when you study endangered species is that you actually do have to spend about 50% of your time conserving that species. So on top of the work that I do and the research that I do, I spend a significant amount of time working in conservation, both within the park and kind of doing managing staff that are involved in doing patrols for illegal activity. But also, I also run an NGO called the Kasisi Project, which works with 10,000 school children that live around the national park. And we make these schools and give kids as many opportunities as possible so that when they grow up, they don't have to cut down the national park for their livelihood. So, you know, what's interesting is that as part of my job as a primatologist, I have also now become kind of this activist for international development and do things that I never thought that I would be doing, you know, tree planting projects, teaching sustainable agriculture, working in classrooms, doing, debates about the environment, trying to do laptop programs, teaching girls how to make reusable menstrual pads, you know, all sorts of things that are not part of our training, but are an important part of conservation, but also an important part of giving back to the communities that we work in and that we depend on in many ways. Lastly, you know, just the last couple of things. I think one of the other things that I take very seriously and why I love coming into schools is that I think as a woman scientist of color, I think that I have a unique opportunity to be a role model for young people who might want to be scientists, but don't often see themselves as scientists. And so I know you probably can't see, but I do have like yellow hair. And a lot of times, like the students, when I go into high school classrooms, are like, "Oh my gosh, you have yellow hair. You look like me." And I'm like, "Yeah, you know," and I kind of have a cool job. So I think that's an important part of my job. And then finally, you know, I am a teacher. I teach, you know, dozens of students every semester, if not hundreds. I advise students. I am their research mentor. And so I do see the value. And I do actually think that chimpanzees are this kind of they're an amazing opportunity to get kids interested in biology and evolution. For students that are not particularly interested in biology or evolution, I think there's something very appealing about the species, very human about them, that gets students interested. And on that note, I just wanted to highlight one of my other endeavors is called Primate Learning in Action. And this is an educational resource that I started with Dr. Alex Rosati at the University of Michigan. And it's a way for us to bring primate knowledge into classrooms from K through college. And so we have a lot of cool learning and teaching modules that we've done for all age groups. So for example, we have 7 modules on chimpanzee behavior that you can kind of go download and has videos attached to it. Target audience is really kind of high school students for this one. There are some modules for younger kids that I'd encourage you to check out. And we also, for maybe more advanced high school students, have statistical modules. So we have two series of 8 modules each to teach students about how to use R and how to analyze and work with data. So that might be something that you could use in your classroom coming up. So this is the one about R. And just lastly, I wanted to make a plug for a spring workshop that Emily and I are organizing for March and April on chimpanzee behavior. It's a 3-part series where we're going to talk about, bringing in guest scientists and some strategies for that, but also teach you how to collect animal behavior data with some videos and tools from my field site, and then how to analyze that chimpanzee data. So how to, determine friendships, how to get the kids to really use something like Google Sheets or Microsoft Excel, and how to work with actual data on chimpanzees. So if you're interested, I think Uzma is going to tell us a little bit more about when that will be released, but that should be a lot of fun. And I know I went a little bit over time because I get very excited about chimps, but I wanted to thank you for your attention. And please, if you are interested in following our work, find us on Twitter, and feel free to email me if you want. And with that, I'll stop sharing, and I'm very, very happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Zarin. That was great. I think we're going to have a robust Q&A. We had a couple of questions in the chat, but as always, we love to start with anyone who would like to use the raise hand feature and ask their question directly to Zarin. So we'll go ahead and start with anyone who would like to ask questions directly. And if not, feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we'll also refer to some of the questions earlier. And if no one has any questions, I have at least 2 dozen. Lori, go ahead, Lori.
I can't remember the name of the chimpanzee who lost his feet, but I was wondering, how did this affect his relationships? Did he have close bonds with other males, or how did they treat him, and how did
that's a great question. So his name is Max. He was pretty close with his mother before his mother died. So she died when he was about 16, and that, I think, was a pretty big loss for him. He does not have very close relationships with any of the other males. I think in some ways they kind of use him as a little bit as a punching bag, because he can't really get away as much, and he does scream a lot. So he does, like I said, he's the lowest ranking male. I have not seen him form any very, very long lasting or close social bonds since his mom died. He does have a younger brother who he spends quite a bit of time with. So that's kind of nice to see. He does not have any offspring that we know of, but the field assistants all cheer when he actually gets to copulate with a female. So I don't know. We try to be his cheerleaders if we can. But like I said, I do think his mother was very low ranking to begin with. And so she was a very shy female. So even before he lost his feet, we didn't know him very well because she was often alone and not very, very social. So, it's possible that he was always going to be kind of shy and not very social and low ranking given his mother's position. But it's hard for us to know.
Thanks, Lori. Let's go to Matt. Go ahead and put your question in the chat, and I can just read it, or Zarin can read it directly.
And maybe in the meantime, Teresa, I can answer your question.
Yeah. Go ahead, Teresa.
I have 2 questions. First of all, because I'm sharing with my colleagues as you're speaking, what were you doing the urine collection for? Mm-hmm. And my second question is, how do I get you to be a guest speaker in my class?
Okay. So I'll answer the second question. Please just send me an email, and it might depend on my timing and my schedule, but we can try to work something out.
Can you just share your contact information again?
Yeah, I think Emily has it in the chat, but Emily, if you don't mind putting that back in the chat, that would be great. What were we doing the urine collection for? We actually do it as part of our long-term data collection. So we collect urine samples every day. We collect probably between 200 and 1,000 urine samples a month. Our biobank at the University of New Mexico has something like 60,000 urine samples in it, going back to about 1995. So we routinely do assays on testosterone, estrogen, cortisol, insulin, just as part of long-term data collection. So one of the things that we found out, for example, is that high-ranking males, actually, yes, they do have higher testosterone, but they also have higher cortisol levels. And cortisol is a measure of stress. So it does seem to be, in many ways, kind of stressful to be a high-ranking male. But the opposite is true for females. So it's the low-ranking females that have the higher cortisol levels. And when I talk about these studies, what we're doing is not just like doing like a month-long study. We've actually done this over 20 years. So we have, this is really robust data, right? This is tracking individuals over the course of their lifetime, which is important for when you have a small sample size. So we do it. And like I said, we do the like pregnancy test routinely. So this is just part of our long-term data. And we try to keep urine samples. We try to keep enough that, I think one of the things, sorry, I'm going to answer a slightly different question, but one of the things that we are tasked with doing, we study an endangered species. So I feel like my job is to document the entire lives of these animals before they go extinct. And in some way that means that we have to be able to use our long-term data to answer questions we don't know we have yet. Right? Like in 10 years, we'll have another question that we want to like go back and answer. And so we try to have data, whether it's urine or behavioral data, that we can use in a very robust way to answer questions that might be very far in the future. And Matt, I'll get to your question, but the urine is collected with like a stick that has a V on it, and you tie a plastic bag, and you like the chimp pees, they pee a lot. So like, they pee a lot. And you just stick the plastic bag in the urine stream from a tree, and you get more urine than you could possibly imagine. And it's very tricky because as soon as they pee, they often poop. So there's like this real sweet spot where you get to get that bag out of the way before you get splattered with poop. And we get splattered with poop anyway. So Matt's question, you mentioned the chimps were habituated to humans. Have we seen any effects of that habituation? Performative behaviors, and how could we weed this out? That's an excellent question. It's very hard to answer because obviously we don't have data when we're not watching them. But one of the things that we do know is that there's a few field sites across the continent that actually take their data with just camera traps, and so no human observation. And what we've noticed is chimp behavior doesn't. A lot of what we're talking about seems pretty consistent across the field sites where they're just doing it with camera traps versus where we're actually observing them. The one instance where that is not true is in intergroup interactions. And so chimpanzees are very xenophobic. Like they really don't like their neighbors and they kill each other, right? If they have an opportunity to kill a neighboring chimp, they will take it. And we've lost several chimps in that way. But the neighboring chimps around our group are not habituated to humans. And so if we happen to be with the chimps when they go on patrol of their boundary, or if they go into the neighboring community to maybe try to kill another chimp, we are like this secret weapon because the other chimps are scared of humans. And so our chimps will always win an interaction if we're present. And it has happened where we've heard like screaming and screaming and screaming, and we've run to like where we hear the screaming because something's obviously happening. And it was very clear that the neighboring group was about to kill one of our chimps, and we just kind of stumbled on it and they ran away, and we inadvertently saved the life of our chimp in so doing. So that's not something that we have much control over, but it's probably the one area where we impact their behavior the most.
I don't see any hands, so we'll go to a question in the chat. And actually, I'm also curious, I'm gonna ask a question built upon that. Do you ever intervene? So you saw this chimp being threatened by a chimp from the neighboring troop. Your presence minimized or encouraged his survival. But would you ever intervene? And if so, at what point does that happen?
We only intervene if what is happened to the chimp is a result of a human interaction. So if two chimps are killing each other, we watch and let it happen. That's partly what we're there to document, right? But if a chimpanzee, for example, like Max, has been injured by a human poacher, or we had one of our chimps got speared by, someone who was guarding their crops, then we will actually do what we can to dart the chimp, to knock them out and provide veterinary care. So I've done probably 6 successful darts where we've removed wire snares that have been around the hands or feet of chimps and most likely saved their hands and feet from coming off. And in those cases, we'll take samples, we'll give them shots of antibiotics just to keep them healthy and weigh them and then let them kind of naturally recover. But like I said, it's really only in anything that's happened with humans. We don't intervene if they have kind of a respiratory illness, because it's impossible for us to know what the source of that respiratory illness is while it's happening. It takes a while to figure that out. And so we have had several epidemics come through the community. In 2013, we actually lost 6 chimps in 5 days to a common cold that we know now was a human rhinovirus, but at the time we didn't, and there's not much we could have done for them anyway.
So sad. I see that John is raising his hand. John, it looks like you are no longer raising your hand. Do you still have a question, John Darian?
Well, yeah, I was kind of connected to what you were just talking about. I was just curious about your protocols in terms of how you observe chimpanzees and collect your data when you were up in a tree. What are things that you have to be mindful of?
Well, we try to be a very quiet presence, not very bright clothes, very quiet, like we don't scream, shout. We have protocols to keep the chimp safe. So like, for example, our field assistants come to the forest and then change their clothes so they're not wearing their home clothes in the forest. So we try to minimize disease transmission that way. We don't eat in front of the chimps. Like I said, we talk quietly. We don't run. So even if they kind of charge at you, it's all a bluff. Like they're not gonna hit you. I promise. After 22 years, I know they will veer off. So you just hold your ground. We stay 10 meters back. We do not touch them. We do not have physical contact with them unless we're doing a veterinary intervention, which is pretty rare. And it's hard. Like sometimes the babies will charge at you, and our protocols are like, you don't laugh, you don't show like emotions, and like sometimes these tiny little baby chimps like do a dominance display at you, and you like can't laugh at them, and that actually can be pretty hard. We just try to minimize our presence, and we try to be kind of like these weird things that follow them around everywhere, but do not cause them do not really do anything.
We'll go to Jesse. Jesse has his hand raised. Go ahead, Jesse.
Hi. First of all, fascinating talk. Thank you for sharing with us. My question was about cortisol levels with the females who you said were in high standing in the tribe, and also how do cortisol levels in general track with longevity in chimps?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So cortisol is a measure of general stress. And so it can actually measure psychosocial stress, but also energetic stress. And so what's likely happening with the females for a low ranking is it's probably twofold. So one, it's that they probably are just energetically not in as good condition as the high ranking females because they're not competing for food as well. So I think it's more of an energetic issue. Whereas with the high-ranking males who have high cortisol, I think that's kind of like a social, like I'm trying to hang on to being alpha male and how, like this is very stressful. How does it affect longevity? That's actually, thank you for bringing it up. It's a work in progress. So maybe come find us in about 10 years and we'll finish that study. No, but we actually do have funding right now from the National Institutes of Health to do a long-term study on chimpanzee aging. And that's actually one of the questions that we're currently working on. So I can't tell you that right now, but we do know, for example, that older chimpanzees, like older humans, have higher cortisol levels. But that actually seems to be just kind of part of like how the cortisol system works. So when we're stressed, for example, you have this cortisol response, and older individuals just have more trouble turning that response off. And that seems to be the case with older chimps as well. It's not necessarily that they're more stressed, but we're going to figure out how it affects longevity in a little bit. And we're also, part of that study is like how friendships can actually modulate cortisol, and like whether if you're high cortisol but have very good friends, whether that actually helps protect your longevity, which is what we see in humans. I think you also asked maybe about development. That's also a work in progress to see like how long-term, whether mothers who have high cortisol when they're pregnant, whether those infants have different outcomes. We know that to be the case in humans. And so that that's just something that is going to take a very large sample size for us to do. So that's, come back 20 years maybe for that one. But that's kind of, when you study chimps, you have to plan for these like very long-term studies decades in advance. So that's what we're doing.
Thank you so much.
Okay, we're going to go to a couple of questions in the chat. Two people, AJ and Meg Spotto, had asked about this book, Mama's Last Hug by Franz de Waal, and they'd like to know about planning for future trips. So they'd like to know, are there examples, the readers recall examples of things like planning for future trips, planning for food, and they're wondering if chimps have a social understanding of their behaviors and how they might impact things in the future. I think you had mentioned that they generally don't have a sense of the future beyond a few days.
Yeah, so I would say with primatology, they're kind of, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but in many ways, kind of two schools of thought with chimpanzees. So Franz de Waal has a very particular school of thought where, I think his idea, and you'll gather from my answer that I do not follow this school of thought, so maybe I'm going to be a little more critical, that chimpanzees and humans are so alike, so isn't it just easier to assume that they have a lot of human-like emotional states and capabilities and cognitive capabilities rather than have the assumption be that they don't and have the data show that they do? So my school of thought is that there are certain aspects of chimpanzee cognition, how they think about the world, how they feel about the world, that we might not have access to because we can't talk to them, right? So one of those things is empathy, for example. So how do you actually show that an animal is capable of empathy? To me, that's one of those questions in science where it's like, it's not like, how do you know it's kind of like, how would you know that an animal has empathy? How would you actually collect data to show that? And to me, I don't actually think it's possible. Like, I don't think that there's anything that we can observe in the wild where we can, or even in captivity, where we can absolutely, without a doubt, say this animal has empathy. There are things that are related. So things like contagious yawning is related to mirror neurons and, is part of probably a neurological response with empathy, but it's not the same as empathy. And so, so for me, I'm like, if I can't show it with data, then I don't have access to that answer. Whereas Franz de Waal is kind of like, let's just assume that's true. And I think that there are values to both of those schools of thought. So I think with Mama's Last Hug, again, I think coming from that school, Franz de Waal has observed a lot of things in captivity, especially with how individuals, when they die, how they're treated. I think that there are differences between captive chimps and wild chimps. And I think when you look at the sum total, for example, of how chimpanzees respond to other dead chimpanzees, what you will find is actually such a varied response that it's very hard to even say that what you're observing is grief, right? Like it's almost impossible for us to get at that information. And I think, so that gets at this question of mortality and do they understand, the death? Do they understand those things? To me, those are questions that we might not be able to answer, but what we can answer in captivity is questions about, like, do they plan ahead? What is their understanding of time? Do they have an understanding of time? And from all of the captive research, it seems like they really just have an understanding of time, a few days, right? Of a few days, but not really much beyond that. Are they conscious of their own behavior? Yeah, I think that they do. I think that they are. It's very hard to scientifically answer that question. So I think that they are very, I think they do have a theory of mind. So I think that they understand the thoughts of others. I think that they are able to kind of make predictions about how other animals will behave and then behave accordingly in their own way. But again, a lot of these questions are things that we probably can't access in the wild and are probably only things that we can access in captivity with experiments, right? With really controlled experiments. And that's not my field, but I do know a lot of people who are psychologists who do that kind of work. And yeah, I think we're still limited. I mean, we can't talk to each other. We can't talk to them. So it's always going to be a little bit limited. I don't know if that answered the question fully, but.
All right, we are almost out of time. So I'm going to share 2 more questions from the chat. One comes from, so I'll share both of them so that you can prepare and answer them in time. The first one comes from Alex, and he would like to know how you were influenced by the work of Jane Goodall. Where do you think there's room for further discovery in the next few decades? And I think that the question that would be interesting to wrap up on is from Hanny. He wanted to know how you feel about chimps in captivity. I think a lot of us are curious about that. You had said a few minutes ago that your work is all about documenting and preserving their life because when they become extinct, and that was definitely a red flag for me. So maybe we can start with the what were you inspired by in terms of Jane Goodall's successes and struggles, and where the field is going in the next few years.
Sure. Okay. I will do this in 4 minutes so that we don't keep you longer than the allotted time. I was not, like, as a young child, I wasn't personally that much influenced by Jane Goodall. I'd obviously seen this documentary and seen that, but I hadn't followed her work as a teenager. And really by the time I was kind of in college, she had really transitioned to just being kind of a conservationist and not doing so much research. So my major influence was my PhD advisor, whose work kind of had really propelled me in college to be kind of curious about this. But she's obviously a huge influence on the field of chimpanzee behavior, but most importantly, and I think we are so grateful for this, is that you all know something about chimpanzees because of Jane Goodall. And we don't need to do that kind of hard work about hey, look how cool this species is, because she has done all of that. And she's a phenomenal advocate for chimpanzees. So I think she has paved the way for that kind of public interest in chimpanzees that has made conservation of this species much easier. So I guarantee you, probably most of you know nothing about the northern woolly lemur, but it's so severely endangered. There are 8 individuals left on the planet, right? And so we don't have that kind of problem where we don't have exposure of our species, and that's all because of Jane, and that is incredibly important. Where our field is going next, I think this is something that I'm really excited about, but for the last probably 30 years, most of us have worked in silos at our own individual field sites, but there are, at least 4 major field sites in Uganda, plus the 2 in Tanzania, plus 1 in Ivory Coast, and a few in Central Africa. And I think the next major group of discoveries is going to be based on the comparative work that we can do together and the collaborations that we do together, where we don't just paint a picture of Kanyawara chimpanzees, but we paint a picture of the variation across the entire species and what that looks like and why we might see all this variation and how flexible those animals really, really are. So that's what I'm very excited to do. Working on a study right now where we're doing that. And lastly, how do I feel about captive chimps? I think zoos are actually incredible places. I think both as a kind of generating public interest for a species and for animals. I think most people will never see chimps in the wild. I think obviously there are lots of zoos and places where we need to really be concerned about the welfare of such a smart, long-lived animal and how we treat them. And so I love to work with zoos and kind of think about those questions. I do think, at the rate that we're losing rainforests, chimpanzees are probably going to be around, of all of the great apes, probably going to be around the longest. They have the highest numbers. They're kind of very resilient in lots of ways. We are going to lose orangutans in our lifetime. I mean, there are 50,000 of them left, and we lose almost, something like 1,000 to 5,000 every year. I mean, there's just almost to me, there's very little chance. And I have friends who study them and are working their asses off to save the species. But I think in our lifetime, we will see kind of these pockets of orangutans in the wild that will slowly disappear. And captive populations, whether they're in zoos or kind of forest reserves and sanctuaries, will probably be the last remaining place. That to me is heartbreaking because captive chimps, for example, and wild chimps are behaviorally very different. So when you save captive chimps and when you have just captive chimps, you are saving the species in terms of their genetics and stuff like that, but you're losing a whole suite of behaviors that you'll never see again and that you'll never be able to replicate. And so I tell my students, I will work my ass off till the day I die to save chimpanzees in the wild. And I'll get emotional, but I'll try, and hopefully you can help.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. The chat is blowing up, so clearly our teachers really, really loved it. So thanks so much, everyone. Have a great night and stay warm. Bye-bye.